I'm David Flint, and this is Conversations with Conservatives, coming to you from Safe Wells TV on the Gold Coast in Queensland, Australia. And my conversation now is with Jai Martinkovits, small businessman and political commentator. Jai, I wanted to begin by asking you about your opinion of the election, and it's in the context of the election being described as a contest between two spendthrift political assassins who daily engage in an auction about money which has been borrowed from overseas. Now, is that a reasonable description, do you think, of the election?
Well, David, good morning. And yes, I think that for the average person on the street, particularly somebody who I suppose the average person wouldn't be reading as much as perhaps you and I would, but sees snapshots of it on news websites and the television news in the evening, they wouldn't understand the difference between the two major parties. It's so minute and minuscule that it's really a race of who can spend the most money. And you would expect that a Liberal government would be the standout in this respect. And I suppose in some small ways there are those differences, but it's not enough to capture the heart and mind of the average voter.
Well, that's exactly it, isn't it? And what we're seeing also is the Liberal Party doing some strange things. For example, the assault on superannuation, that is the savings of the people who are trying to not be dependent on government. What's your opinion of the move against superannuation?
Well, look, I mean, there has to be some sort of reform, but the levels that they're setting it at, and particularly the fact that I think that a lot of people would be in the category where the man's superannuation would be larger and the woman may have made a lifestyle choice to leave work and look after the children where that's possible. So her superannuation balance would likely be much smaller. So why would you not consider it that you have a joint picture of absolute bare minimum? But if you are going to have it in the threshold that they're suggesting, it should at least be spread across the two.
Well, say it's right. Say that they've come to the right decision. I certainly don't think they do, because when you look at the amount involved for two, and you have it for two people, one of whom has no superannuation or, as you say, very little, and you put it in the bank, they're talking about getting 5%. Well, you can't get 5% from any bank that I know of, certainly not in Australia, any bank that you would put money in. Now, why didn't they do it properly? Why do it without notice, contrary to what the Treasurer had warned against 3 months before, when they have a Productivity Commission report? The way you change something as delicate as superannuation and maintain confidence, I would have thought, is you start out with a discussion paper, you consult everyone, and you come to a conclusion which most people think is, well, that's a reasonable conclusion. Why do it in a budget and then go straight to an election?
Well, superannuation is such a long-term thing, and people make lifestyle and other choices for their retirement when they're much younger, or at least they should be thinking about these things when they're younger. So for people to suddenly have made plans on a certain basis and then for their plans to really be ripped out, have the rug ripped out underneath, it's not fair. And I think that's how people are feeling, is that this is not fair. This isn't something that they understood was the case long term. And the more important structural reforms around where people can simply withdraw large chunks of their balance at retirement and then still be reliant on the taxpayer, that's the more concerning thing rather than thresholds.
You're in the financial world, Jai. You would be mixing with a lot of people who could be described as aspirational voters, not necessarily conservative, but aspirational. They have plans about their careers. Is there any discussion among people that you know, any concern being expressed about this move against superannuation?
There is, and I think people are sort of taking the view that they want to do something independently of the superannuation structure because of confidence being undermined. So where, for example, there are obvious tax benefits in doing things through a superannuation structure, people are now even thinking, well, why don't I buy this outside of a superannuation structure? Yes, I'm not going to get all of those benefits which are arguably fair benefits, and they would prefer to do it in their personal names or through other vehicles.
One of the things that they have attacked is the transition to retirement, part of superannuation. I wasn't really terribly aware of this until I read a bit more about it, and what it involves is encouraging people to stay in the workforce but collect some of their superannuation on the way when they're in that latter period of their working lives. And it seemed to me to be very strange to have a go at that as though it was some sort of rort, particularly when politicians seem to be able to retire quite young.
Well, there's definitely a double standard there, and I think that the average person thinks, well, why should they have particular superannuation benefits and the political class has completely different rules? Now, they would argue, of course, that their shelf life is limited, yet they're arguing that other people should be now working until much older ages, and that they should then be moving into other career paths. So why then can't politicians, after they've finished their political career, if that's what one could call it, move into some other career, or fall back perhaps on the career that they should have come from, rather than being career politicians and simply moving through unions in the case of Labor, or otherwise with other parties?
Are there other aspects of the government's policy which are being discussed, do you think?
In relation to?
Well, for example, in relation to the control of the borders.
Other non-superannuation matters. Yes, I think that there are definitely core issues in this election, and I think that a lot of that is around people's concerns at the moment around terrorism and immigration-related matters. And of course, we've seen the terrible events that have unfolded recently in the United States, in Orlando. And I think that that's been a further wake-up call for people in Australia. We've had our own incidents, but yet government just simply seems to want to sweep this under the rug and ignore what the problems really are. And if you see what the conversation has turned into America, it's been about, well, was the shooter, was he gay? Did he attend this club regularly, and what was his true motivations? He made his motivations extremely clear. He phoned the emergency services and declared the reasons that he was doing this was related to Islamic State and his support thereof. So why are we not taking him at face value, at least as his primary motivation? And even in Australia, we don't seem to call things as they are. We always try to find some other reason for it. And I think Australians are very concerned around national security matters. That, to me, seems to be the primary concern that Australians have going into this election.
There seems to be, on the part of the politicians, a determination to push the line that Islam is a peaceful religion. And that seems to be something, for example, the Prime Minister's used that. He has said that all religions have a golden rule of love thy neighbour as yourself. This seems to be an interesting thing, an aspect of political life. But at this point, the time has caught up with us, so we'll go to a break and we'll come back to these issues after the break. This is Conversations with Conservatives. I'm David Flint, and I've been speaking to Jai Martinkovits, and we'll continue after the break. I'm David Flint, and this is Conversations with Conservatives, coming to you from Safe Worlds on the Gold Coast in Queensland in Australia. And I'm talking with Jai Martinkovits. Jai Martinkovits is the co-author with me of give us back our country. And this perhaps has some relevance in relation to what's going on in Australia at the moment. After Malcolm Turnbull, coming more from the left, knifed, I gather the Prime Minister doesn't like the word knifed, but he used it himself in relation to what happened in the Labor Party. After he knifed Tony Abbott, Mark Textor, who's the political advisor in relation to polling to the Liberal Party, said that the Conservatives in the Liberal Party who were very unhappy about the knifing of Tony Abbott didn't matter because they have nowhere else to go. They will vote Liberal, and the next election will be won from the centre because Malcolm Turnbull will attract voters from the centre. That's not the view that I'm hearing from a number of conservative Liberals, people who have voted Liberal all their lives, and they seem to be looking round for other candidates to vote. And I'm wondering, Jai, what your reaction is to that.
Well, there is definitely truth to that, and I certainly think that Malcolm Turnbull is not attracting the centre as it was suggested that he might from other facets of politics. So the question really becomes about what should his natural support base, or rather the Liberal Party's natural support base be, and what should they do? So I certainly speak to a lot of people who are very disaffected with what has transpired within the Liberal Party, and they're looking for other alternatives. So the question is, where do they turn? And I think that they are looking to other parties, particularly in the lower house and also to a certain extent with the upper house. Where can they turn? So there's a couple of options that people seem to be defaulting to, the Liberty Alliance being one and the Christian Democrats being the other. So it'll be interesting to see where does that disaffected Liberal vote lie. Will people go to a party which I suppose has a long history, particularly obviously at the state level, like the Christian Democrats, 35 years I think it is, and they do have a proven track record in that respect, or the new emerging, which they certainly do have some interesting candidates, the Liberty Alliance.
What do you think of the Liberal Democrats, where Senator Lynhelm is the Liberal Democrat candidate in New South Wales? Are they a Conservative party? They seem to straddle. They seem to be economically conservative, but quite radical in social policy and curious in relation to guns.
Well, they are true libertarians, I suppose is the way you could put it. So although I agree with them in some respects, and David Lynhelm, I'm sure, is a very lovely man, and as a person, I'm sure he's fantastic. But when it comes to policy, I'm one of those people who also considers the social side of things to be very important. So as you know, it can divide people once you get into the social issues. And that's the thing which always struck me about Can Do as very important, was that it never shied away from taking conservative positions on social issues as well, even if that did restrict our potential support base. So to me, that's that turns me off the Liberal Democrats and Senator Lynhelm to an extent as well.
Senator Lynhelm has an interesting policy in relation to guns. He says that at the present time the police have guns and the criminals have guns, but the general public are very much restricted in their ability to have guns.
I think that it's too late in Australia to reverse what happened. Not that it was to the extent, of course, as in America, but when John Howard took away guns, I thought that was probably unnecessary, because the people who it was intended to take them away from, of course, still very much have access to them. But if you look at the debate in the context of the United States, it's extremely different. In Australia now, I think it would be impossible to return to what we had before. It's too late.
Miranda Devine, who's a very good columnist, I don't always agree with her. I think her views on Tony Abbott are not correct. But she devised the term DELCON, delusional conservatives, and those are conservatives who are so deluded they think Tony Abbott is coming back. They also are not going to vote for the Liberals, some of them. There is an argument among some Conservatives that the Liberal Party would do very good they'd be purged. By being purged, they would reform. And there are some who even say they'd be happy with the Labour government, although the present Labour opposition seems to have not learned anything. They're not like Hawke or Keating. They've not learned anything from their years in office, and they seem to be prone to profligacy again.
Well, they talk the talk in some respects, but I don't believe it. It's like, for example, what they're talking about in relation to asylum seekers and border policy. They're saying that they'll support the policy which they opposed before. So is that something which is a recognition of the success of that policy, or is it just something that they know is popular and that once they get into government they would then renege on? I tend to think the latter. So yes, I think there has been a certain level of recognition of what's happened in the past, but it's so minute that I have no confidence in it whatsoever.
You're the executive director in a voluntary position of Australians for Constitutional Monarchy, a position first held by Tony Abbott. And you will be aware that on the Queen's birthday, the leader of the Greens, Dr. Di Natale, called on Malcolm Turnbull, a noted Republican, to hold a referendum, to start with a plebiscite and hold a referendum by, I think, 2020 on Australia becoming a republic. What do you think of that?
Well, there are two different proposals, of course, to have a plebiscite or a referendum.
I think it's a plebiscite, then a referendum.
Well, yes. I mean, it's that cascading effect which is the problem, because there's no detail. If it were possible for a Republican to devise an otherwise unexplored model and to put that to the people through a referendum, if there were merits to that proposal and it was discussed and people felt that there was a vote that was necessary, that would be fine. But to proceed first with a plebiscite, undermining confidence in our existing system with nothing to replace it, to me that's just not the proper way to approach these things.
The Labour Party policy is to have two plebiscites and the election of the convention and a referendum. That's 4 votes. You'd be using probably the better part of $1 billion in, I suspect, coming to a worse conclusion than that in 1999.
Look, I think at this time, when you look at the level of support, and as a young person, I'm particularly interested in the level of support amongst young people, which, as you well know, is now in excess, or at least equal to, but certainly it seems to be in excess of that of the elderly. So it is a ticking time bomb. That's probably why they're trying to find a balance between pushing the agenda forward now and the generally understood timing for it of waiting until the Queen eventually does pass on. But they probably realise that there is a ticking time bomb when they look at the polls, and they also realise, because you always remind them, that it would be very difficult for them to capture that momentum at the time of the Queen's passing, because everything will kick into play with the new monarch and
you're exactly right. Time has caught up with us again, so we're going to another break. And this is Conversations with Conservatives. I'm David Flint, and I'm talking with Jai Martinkovits.
Hello everyone, I'm Paul Higgins, and welcome to Safe Worlds TV, the global marketplace, the world leader in internet TV and semantic search, the home of free enterprise, the level playing field that all the world can use for electronic business. With Safe Worlds TV, every business in every country of the world can now be involved in the world economy. There are no barriers to entry. Even the poorest countries and the smallest businesses can be involved. The system is simple. Every country divides into 12 headline channels. Every channel is a gateway to an unlimited number of related community channels. Every community is a social network and a marketplace to sell products and services. There is no limit to the number of businesses that can be connected into a marketplace. There is no limit to the number of products you can sell. All our channels and marketplaces are designed to keep you entertained and to help you do internet business at a cost that everyone can afford. The amazing semantic technology that underpins Safe Worlds TV allows us to deliver this amazing system to the world. It allows us to accommodate millions of TV channels and marketplaces and to link them together into the global marketplace. The vast global marketplace that we are building is the final piece of the electronic global village. This is the ultimate achievement of the internet. What you see here now is only the tip of the iceberg of semantic services that are coming. Come now and see what we've already got. Choose any country of the world, then select the headline channel that you want to explore. Just point and click and follow the logical tree structure. We think you'll be amazed at what we already have in Safe Worlds TV. When you're ready, click on the button at the bottom of the screen and register to become a user. You can start immediately to create your very own internet TV channel. Enjoy the experience. I'm Paul Higgins for Safe Worlds TV.
I'm David Flint. This is Conversations with Conservatives coming to you from Safe Worlds TV from the Gold Coast in Queensland in Australia, and I'm talking to Jai Martinkovits. Jai, one of the peculiar things that we find in our parliaments today is that politicians seem to be chosen not so much on merit, not all of them of course, but so often in pre-selections, they're chosen not so much on merit, they're chosen for their allegiance to a particular power broker. We certainly don't see what we see in the United States, where the people take part very liberally in pre-selections. You wrote about this in our book, Give Us Back Our Country. What do you see as the answer to that problem? Or do you see it as a problem that politicians are quite often not chosen on merit?
Well, yes, I certainly do see it as a huge problem, and it all boils down to one word, which of course is accountability. And I suppose the other concepts that flow into that are transparency as well. So it's really a bit of a cause and effect type of situation, and I think that the cause is largely the undemocratic process, particularly in New South Wales, but certainly our system generally is geared in that way, where the pre-selections are not delivering the best candidates. They're rewarding people for their loyalty, as you say, to a particular leader within that factional group of a party, and it's not producing good results in terms of policy within the parliament. So yes, we need to have reform on one side, where if the parties are expecting to receive certain benefits, which they do receive in terms of financial benefits and other benefits, including privacy exemptions and so on, then they should be expected to have their memberships do more than sell raffle tickets and raise money and hand out leaflets on election day, which is really what they've been reduced to, and to actually give them a direct say in the election, or pre-selection rather, of a candidate who's then put forward to the people. So no matter what party we're talking about, the quality of the candidate will be as good as it can be from that particular electorate, and the people can then choose from a reasonable selection of people. Once those people are in the parliament, they should then be accountable. And yes, they are accountable every 3 or 4 years, where we do have an opportunity to choose, as I said, from a limited selection of average candidates in many cases. But once they're in the parliament, they should be able to be recalled to an early election if they're underperforming. And I think that that's not something which would be used extensively. And also when there's a particular policy which is put forward that just simply defies the common sense of the average voter, and I think that we can trust that the average voter is equipped with common sense and good judgment, then they should be able to repeal that piece of legislation. And of course, there's also the opportunity with a third proposal that we raise to propose legislation, because there are certain things that are not in the interests of the political class, and relying on them to introduce such common sense measures is probably not going to happen.
One of the obvious way that you would initiate a recall or appeal or even new legislation is by a petition. That's done in most countries that practice this, most jurisdictions that practice this. What percentage do you think would be a safe percentage, not too difficult to achieve, but not something that's going to produce too many of these?
Well, the threshold should not be excessively high where people can't achieve it, but equally it shouldn't be low where some issue which is a boutique issue doesn't get the level of support required to bring it to the attention of other voters. So there's two things that flow into that, I think. One is the apathy of Australians generally when it comes to political matters. I don't think that Australians throw their support behind any and every idea. So that tends to bring it a little bit lower in my mind. But then equally you have to balance the effect of large lobby groups, like for example, GetUp would be one example, which has a large membership. And if all that was required was for them to send out a broadcast email and say, please click here to sign the petition, then they could probably gather a large number of signatures very quickly. So I would think that with those two factors in mind, from the top of my head, somewhere around 10% would probably be a good starting point. But that's just my personal initial thought, 10 to 15%. But of course, as we propose in our book, having a convention to discuss all of these different considerations and to make a proposal to put to the people would be the way forward.
Well, there's a good history, isn't there? A good historical basis for the convention, because the Corowa, without the Corowa conference and then the subsequent elected conventions, my view is we would probably never have federated.
That's a fair analysis.
Yes, because the thing is that until then, if a convention came and agreed on a constitution and it went back to the state or then colonial parliaments, they'd all tear it apart again, as would happen today. And you'd never get anywhere because they'd never agree. What the magic of the Corowa plan was, as I understand it, that not only was the convention to be directly elected, but also once the convention came to a conclusion, it would be sent to the state parliaments for comment. And then the convention would come to its conclusion, and then there'd be referendums. You'd have to have a similar thing in Australia, wouldn't you? You'd have to say, the politicians would have to agree, well, the convention will consult us with what they want, but we agree that when they finally come to a conclusion, that will have to be put to the people.
I think that there's a few points on that. One is, as we've said in our book, that it should be unpaid so that it makes sure that only people who are genuinely interested in this, rather than the usual suspects who just want to...
You'll remember when we raised that in a parliamentary committee, one politician was outraged by that provision that you not be paid.
Yes, well, if somebody who's a humble mortgage broker is prepared to, assuming they're afforded the opportunity to participate in such a conference at no charge, then I think that anybody who's genuinely interested could also make that effort. So I don't think it need be paid. The second thing is that there are other issues that are on the national agenda, which some of which I agree and some of which I don't, which may also be discussed. So it's not only this issue which the convention could be called for, but it could deal with a range of issues.
Good. And we also raised the prospect, did we not, which is going a little further, perhaps confusing it, that in relation to matters concerning the law, perhaps grand juries, a very old English institution which we used to have and the Americans have kept, should be used rather than organizations like ICAP, because a grand jury is made up of ordinary people and they decide in private, without it ever becoming public, that whether or not there is sufficient evidence for a prosecution to be launched, and then it becomes public if the prosecution is launched. And you get away from that situation where innocent people are named before an organisation like ICAC, as Margaret Cunneen, the brilliant Crown Prosecutor in New South Wales was.
Mm. Well, the interesting thing, and yes, there's certainly a lot of merit to that, was when this was raised in Victoria in the not too recent, or not too distant rather, past, as a way of advancing a particular matter, and it was then very quickly removed.
Yes, that's so. And on that point, we'll go to a break. This is Conversations with Conservatives. I'm David Flint, and I'm in discussion with Jai Martinkovits. I'm David Flint. This is Conversations with Conservatives, coming to you from Safe Worlds TV on the Gold Coast in Queensland in Australia. And I'm in discussion with Jai Martinkovits. Jai, in our book, we referred to America as one of the models. America and Switzerland, to an extent Canada, one of the models of making our political system more democratic. Now, we've seen this vividly in the last few months in the United States, in the various primaries and caucuses being held in the American states, particularly in relation to the Republican Party, but also in relation to the Democratic Party. I'm wondering, what do you think of what has been happening in the United States in the American presidential election?
Well, firstly, the thing that attracts me to the way that process plays out is twofold. It's the democratic nature, which I think is far superior to our system in the way that candidates are pre-selected. And it's not without problems, I'll certainly give you that, and also expense, and it certainly drags out over a longer period of time. But doing it on a more limited scale in Australia, perhaps without open primaries, but certainly primaries of, or plebiscites, whatever you want to call it, of party members, to me is an extremely attractive proposition. I also think that in America, the way that it's not compulsory for people to vote is also right. I don't believe that in Australia we should have compulsory voting. So from that side of things, I'm very interested in what does transpire in the United States, and also their position as, I suppose, the leader of the free world. So it's very relevant to us here in Australia as well. So I have taken a particular interest. At the moment, of course, things have settled a little more, but watching this process over the last number of months has been very interesting. I was particularly interested in one candidate, which was Senator Cruz, but as you well know, he failed to get the level of support that was required. I now think that America is in a pretty dire situation, choosing between two extremely unattractive candidates, and I'm not talking about their looks necessarily, but having Hillary Clinton would be an absolute disaster. But at least it's the devil you know. When you look at Donald Trump, I think that he's a terrible candidate in the sense of his policies. In terms of his ability to run a successful campaign, he's been fantastic. So what do Americans do from here? I think they probably have to make a personal decision about which is the lesser of, in my opinion, two evils, and how do they move forward.
Well, that's the same situation in Australia, isn't it? It's the lesser of two evils. Which government will waste less money than
well,
the
in
other?
Australia, we do have, of course, the opportunity for minor parties to probably have more of an influence than in America. I don't know if you agree with that, but it would certainly seem that if there were a balance of power held in Australia, it may limit the agenda of whoever emerges. In America, when you talk about a presidential candidate, it's very different to political parties in Australia because their role is very different to that of, say, a prime minister.
Yes, well, when Mr. Hawke expanded the size of the House and therefore the Senate under the Constitution, I don't think he ever hoped to introduce so many minor parties into the Senate, and the same with the introduction of proportional representation. All those were done with an intention of improving the situation of the Labor Party. These were the unintended consequences of political acts. But I think there are a couple of things which emerge from the American pre-selections, and one thing I think is a mistake, and that is and I think there's a great advantage in varying things between states. This idea that everything has to be uniform is an Australian obsession. If there's ever a problem in Australia, they always say, oh, the problem is we've got to make things uniform, and we have one system, as though that's the only answer. But two things, I think, there are two weaknesses that have come out of this. One are the superdelegates in the Democratic Party, because that allows, I don't think it'll have this effect this time, but that allows rorting. You give more votes to party officials.
Yeah.
And that means that they can control the pre-selection much more in the Democratic Party. The other thing is in some states where they have open primaries, I think you should either be a party member or a registered supporter. The idea of the open primaries, I think, has meant that many Democrat voters have come in and they've voted for, they've sometimes voted for Mr. Trump rather than Senator Cruz, and I think it's distorted a number of the votes.
The other thing that will be particularly interesting is to see what President Obama does in his last few months in office. And it seems to be that there's a suggestion that he'll move on gun control through a presidential order, what's the term, through executive order rather, to restrict guns. So normally, of course, that should be done through other processes, but there's a suggestion that he will do that through executive order, and how people will respond to that if he does do it will be interesting to see.
He's vastly expanded the powers of the presidency, and the courts seem to have so far, apart from a couple of instances, let him do that. But so has the Senate. For example, the Senate, the Republican majority in the Senate, with Senator Cruz dissenting, outrageously, I think, gave him the power to enter into effectively the treaty with Iran, which allows them to go ahead with nuclear weapons, although it says the opposite, freed them from the sanctions.
These things, the problem with this is, even if it's determined later and it's challenged to be determined unconstitutional, say for example with gun control, once these things take effect, and it takes years to go through the courts to reach some decision, sometimes it can be very difficult to reverse it, even though it has been determined unconstitutional. So it's very underhanded in the way that they achieve these goals, and it's not respecting the Constitution and the way that the founders intended that to be.
And this is, I think, emphasized by the way in which the courts have seized legislative and constitutional making power, particularly in the United States. Judicial activism has had an appalling effect in the United States, where the Supreme Court has seized powers to rewrite the Constitution. The Constitution means what I say it means. That's what many judges seem to be saying in America. For example, they've created a constitutional right to abort, which does not exist in the Constitution, and they've now created a constitutional recognition of same-sex marriage, which is a question for the states. Abortion, the law in relation to abortion, the law in relation to marriage are state matters very clearly, I think, under the Constitution. What do you think of that?
Yeah, look, I completely agree. And when you look at, for example, the way that they looked at the issue of abortion through privacy and otherwise, if you actually go back and study Roe versus Wade and you see what happened thereafter with the plaintiffs, there was a completely different change of attitude. So I think that was really just captured on as a way of achieving an objective, and certainly wasn't with the plaintiff in mind, let's put it that way.
Yes, and on that point, we've, again, the clock has beaten us. We'll now conclude this very interesting, at least I think from my point of view, session. Viewers will no doubt not be surprised that we agreed with one another since we wrote a book together. But thank you very much, Jai.
My pleasure.
This is David Flint, and we're in the program Conversations with Conservatives from Safe Worlds TV on the Gold Coast in Queensland in Australia. And I've been speaking with Jai Martinkovits.